and then they left them out. It's like I'm concerned about the lineup.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming this evening. Before I hand over to Sue Onslow, who will be chairing tonight's discussion, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live this evening. So over to Sue.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope my mic's working. Welcome to everyone. I think that the number here in the audience is a fantastic indication of the interest here in London, of the extraordinary events and this extraordinary election down in Zimbabwe. I'm afraid I don't think it's make or break, but I do think that this is a unique event that we are witnessing. It gives me great pleasure to be chair here this evening and to welcome the three panelists who will be speaking on the topic of the elections. Wilfred Banga is, of course, founder, publisher, and editor of the Zimbabwean newspaper. He's also founder and the first chief executive of the Associated Newspapers of Zimbabwe, the publishers of the Daily News, which closed down in 2003. Chofamba Innocent Sitole is a Zimbabwean journalist and currently works as the assistant editor for the London-based News Africa magazine. He's also a regular commentator on African affairs and has appeared on BBC Focus, on Africa, and Al Jazeera's The Listening Post, among others. And Simukai Tinu is an African affairs analyst based here in London. His work has been published in the Financial Times, in The Guardian, Sky News website, that's an interesting range here, the Christian Science Monitor, and Think Africa Press, among others. I'm a senior research fellow now at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. I'm a historian, but I'm running a big oral history project on the history of the Commonwealth, and I've written regularly on Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and coming up to present-day Zimbabwe. What I'd like to do is to run this very much as a panel discussion between the four of us before opening it out to questions from the floor and to really engage or be. It's often said that elections are stolen well before actually anybody thinks about putting a cross on the piece of paper. So I'd like to ask my three co-panelists to reflect on the extent to which there has been, shall we say, a vital conditioning of this election even before we got to the start of today. So, Wilf, if I could ask you to, to remark on that.
Well, what has happened in Zimbabwe is Mugabe realized that in the last election, the African Union, SADC, condemned him for the 400 people who were killed in the run-up to the elections. There were people with broken bones, in hospitals, and there was evidence of violence which he couldn't deny. This time around, he's decided he's not going to do that. There will be peace. People will vote peacefully. And so there are no dead bodies, there are no broken bones, but they are manipulating the figures. It started with the registration of voters. If you look at, with the benchmark, the 2012 census figures, that's what we use. They've registered people between the ages of 18 and 30, only 8%. People who are over 80, 220%. There are over 100,000 people who are over 100 years old in a country where the average age is 40. We have also got the figures in the urban and rural areas, which is almost equal. But they've registered 1.8 million people in the urban areas and 4 million people in the rural areas. And we have a voting population of, we are told, 6 million out of a population of 12, which means for every child, there's one adult, which makes me doubt those figures. And on top of that, they have also manipulated the figures for the various groups. You'll find that in rural areas, some constituencies have over 150% registration. And in urban areas, the percentage is very low. So they're going to do it with figures, not beating up people.
So if you've got a conditioning factor of fear against the background of that form of violence, which can have a very long-lasting hangover, but Chief Omid, would you agree that this whole question of voter manipulation on the registration is key, or is it gerrymandering actually of election boundaries, of the ward boundaries, that is also a factor here?
I would say that it is not one aspect at the expense of another that ZANU-PF has focused on as a strategy to approach this election. But what is happening now has been part and parcel of what they've always, how they've always approached, elections previously. Before I speak about the registration and the constituency delimitation, I would want to point out at least one thing that I think is a positive. I think the demobilization of violent wings of all parties, as it were, because it's true that all parties engage in violence. ZANU-PF simply has perhaps maybe a bigger capacity for violence, because apart from relying on a state, security structures, it also has and can sponsor paramilitary, structures like the youth militia, for instance. And so, standing toe-to-toe with the MDC, ZANU-PF can outmuscle, its rivals. And perhaps maybe one would say that the incidence of violence, or perhaps maybe the culture of violence cultivated by ZANU-PF over time has almost compelled, their rivals, perhaps maybe, to take certain defensive measures, but inadvertently being also drawn into the same culture and cycle of violence. And this is what, sadly, Zimbabwe electoral politics has been mired into. And so I take it as a positive that for quite some time, over the course of the year, all political leaders, including Mugabe himself, were talking up, the idea of peace, demobilizing their violent supporters, and perhaps maybe drumming the message home to those who acted with impunity that this time round, the party may not come to your aid. The fact that we've come to election day, having witnessed very organized campaigning by all parties traversing the countryside fairly freely without, the kind of violence that we've been used to, is testament perhaps maybe to the effectiveness of that message, of peace which they invested in. So I want to acknowledge that as a positive. But having said that, the party in power, or the party in charge, which is ZANU-PF, they've been, you could say they've retreated from the foreground of violent politics because it is unsustainable. They still have other things within their arsenal, and what Wilf has just addressed. They control the institutions that register voters, that delimit constituencies, and that has pretty much, been, evidence in this election.
Would you agree about this whole question of an insidious background of a culture of violence, while still acknowledging that it has been a remarkably peaceful poll, and that is in fact very, very much to be praised?
Should I just point out one thing that I think we do forget that in the first round of the presidential elections in 2008, there was very limited violence. It was only in the second round when Mugabe had realized that there was a potential that he can actually lose the presidency. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is a surge in violence if there's going to be a runoff here.
I really want to come on to this whole question of the poll, but then it's quite a question of acknowledging and accepting the result. But in the whole background, all right, in the run-up to today, how important, though, has been voter education of how to register their vote? We've got a system in which it is both first past the post for the presidential and aspects of the assembly, but also the introduction of an element of proportional representation. Now, I looked at the instructions of the Constitution, and it made me quite cross-eyed trying to work out exactly what was going on. Wilf, what would you say about this whole question of voter education?
Well, they've deliberately avoided, or stopped any organization from educating the people about where to vote, how to vote, and how they're going to arrive at the figures. They've actually criminalized voter education. a number of people have actually been arrested who were found to be educating people how to vote, where to put an X. They will be going to court after the elections because they've committed a criminal offense. They said only ZEC, the Zimbabwe Election Commission, is authorized to give voter education, but they didn't have the manpower to do it. So people have gone into this election ignorant about, well, first of all, whether the names are on the voters' roll or not, where the voting booths were going to be until yesterday. They didn't even know whether their names appear on the voters' roll until this morning when they pitched up. And a lot of people in Harare have been turned away because they've been told their names don't appear. So, people were completely ignorant. And like you, Sue, I'm also ignorant about the way they're going to arrive at their numbers for this proportional representation in various provinces. We've not been educated, enough.
Yeah, and I'd like to say that I think after this voting, one of the most significant phases of this election is when the lawyers, start haggling over the allocation of proportional representation seats, because even party activists or party officials, I doubt that everybody is clear on how this is going to work. There is not much expectation, there's no enlightened expectation from the electorate as to how perhaps maybe the balance of power might look when you factor in PR. So that is something that the lawyers are ruminating over, but not for the ordinary job.
Okay, and under the Constitution, the result has to be announced, of course, within 5 days, by the 5th of August. Now, that doesn't allow a lot of time for appeals to the Constitutional Court to try and sort this out, which, again, is written in that Constitution.
But, the Constitutional Court is packed with Mugabe judges. Mugabe has been very careful. This is one thing you've got to give him. He knows, he does his homework. Before the elections, they were agreeing on what needs to be done. Nobody should contest the results of the election. And we should have a full bench of the Constitutional Court, 9 judges. And before they're appointed, there must be consultation between the president and the prime minister and so on. And the Mugabe, a few days after this agreement, just went ahead and appointed all the judges unilaterally. Didn't consult the prime minister. And he put in his ZANU-PF activists. And you look at what has happened in the last few weeks. Every case brought by MDC has been lost. And they've been embarrassed to even give the reasons for their judgment. Up to now, as we speak, MDC lost the cases and they were told the reasons will be delivered later, after the elections.
I do concur, because if you look at most of the judges, they do benefit from ZANU-PF patronage networks. I think in 2008, 2007, we do recall a lot of the senior judges receiving televisions and top of the range Mercedes-Benz from the government. You also find that historically, most of the judgments that have been made have actually been in favor of ZANU-PF. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the MDC to make any challenges of the outcome of the electoral.
I think so, and after all, one of the key pillars of the Commonwealth at this point are the Latimer House principles, which are the independence of the judiciary. So it doesn't seem if ZANU-PF were to come back in, that Zimbabwe would be welcomed back into the Commonwealth anytime soon, unless this aspect one of these aspects has been addressed. But we mentioned the elephant in the room, the Mugabe factor. Now, how much, gentlemen, do you honestly think this is genuinely going to be an aspect of this election? Or is there far too much hype focusing upon an elderly, and I'm afraid sick, former liberation leader who is 89?
Sorry.
No,
I stirred a hornet's nest on my Facebook page when I put up a post saying that when all is said and done, all these policies that the government, that the parties have presented to the voters, the thing that is going to be critical in the minds of voters is that Robert Mugabe is 90 years old. He's sick, and well, not that he's insane or he's. I mean, he. yeah, he's physically unwell. He's physically unwell, and he's been in the job for the last 33 years since the founding of Zimbabwe as an independent state. Quite clearly, it is ludicrous, to imagine that young people, even Zimbabweans looking to the future with hope, would be seized with this zeal to go and thrust this old man back into the seat and say, lead us to, to the future, to this big, bright, bold future, as it were. And so I said, I think Tsvangirai is going to carry it. But of course, that didn't sit well with the ZANU-PF supporters on my Facebook list.
I'm sure it didn't.
Right, I'm going to differ slightly. I think Robert Mugabe does appeal to a certain section of the Zimbabwean population. You're looking at the people in the rural areas, and then you're looking at even some young, educated people in the urban areas who do buy into his rhetoric. Now, the thing with people who support ZANU-PF, it's very difficult for them to come out in the open, particularly if you're young, and say, I'm ZANU-PF, because it's not popular, it's not something which is trendy. For you to be, trendy, you have to be seen to be supporting Tsvangirai. I do think it's going to be a factor. It's not going to be a very big factor, but I think it's going to be a factor.
Well, there are a number of people, mainly in the rural areas, particularly the old people, over 60, who remember the war before 1980, and the conditions were atrocious. And they regard Mugabe as a hero. He brought about independence. He brought about an end to the war. And he will always be a hero. And if you add to that mix absence of information, where people are not informed about what has happened to that hero, that is no longer the hero. He's failed to adjust. He's still in a war mode. He's still talking about third Chimurenga, Chimurenga the war. He's still fighting. He's behaving like a guerrilla fighter, and his government. He thinks.
But Wilf, he has been consistent. It's just the rest of the world has changed. No, I think
right.
this is the state of Zimbabwe has also changed.
He's still in that mode, 1979 mode, and he needs to move into this century.
Yeah, there's something I wanted to add to that. When I made this point about Mugabe's age and health and his long incumbency, I'm looking at Robert Mugabe as the person, and on that basis, I didn't see reasons why people would really have faith in him living on to lead the country into the future. But that is not to say that the ideas of Robert Mugabe don't hold some attraction. Indeed, they do. I think even among young people, there is this admiration for a leader who is seen to be strong, who can stand up to powerful countries or powerful interests, and which is something that resonates not only in Zimbabwe, but across Africa. The reason maybe you've wondered why certain African countries seem to admire this big, bad Robert Mugabe, what's it with him that they admire? In South Africa, he goes to the ANC Congress or to is it an African Union or SADC Congress, and is applauded more than the local politicians. The thing about economic empowerment, popular empowerment, anchoring the economy within Zimbabwe, or even land reform, these are popular issues. The implementation of these policies, and perhaps maybe the fallout from their implementation, has had really deleterious effects to the economy. But the ideas and the principles that he enunciates, they resonate quite resoundingly with a certain mass of the population.
No, so what he encapsulates rather than the actual physical persona of him.
Yeah. So the trouble is he the only one who can embody this or stand for this? Why doesn't he hand over to some younger person to drive the same policies?
But it's precisely because he does represent a trend of opinion that manages to cross age boundaries. But picking up on your age boundaries points, what's the demographic profile of the voters of Zimbabwe? It's after all often identified that this is a fundamentally young population. That, so you make reference to the older people. What percentage of the voters' roll do they represent?
Well, in the past we used to say that the young people, were they were 3 to 1 adult. But according to the figures that we have seen, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
So they've manipulated the figures, and they've made sure that the young people are not registered to vote. And I would say that, Tsvangirai draws most of his support in the urban areas among the young people. But also now, one of the things that Zimbabwe has managed to achieve is the penetration of the cell phone. It's become, we can talk about that later.
Well, no, Wilf and I were talking about this beforehand because, after all, this monitoring, as Rita has shown very, very clearly, it's getting very, very close attention. But do we honestly think that the Zimbabwe mobile phone system is going to hold up? Is it going to be allowed to hold up?
I don't think so, because I think if you look at ZANU-PF, they just don't care. Even if the people at the polling stations are going to send the details of the voting at each polling station, the figures of the voting at each polling station to whoever, for example, to their individual parties. I think what ZANU-PF will rely on is ZEC, which is obviously partisan. They will say, look, we are going to wait for the official results, which are going to be announced by ZEC, which might sort of be different from the results that might be sent by the individual people, by the individuals who represent each political party at each polling station. So I don't think that is going to have any major effect on the
actual vote.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Yes.
What's the experience of your reporters who are down in Zim at the moment?
Well, we've got reporters in rural areas and in the urban areas. And last night, they all started experiencing problems with their cell phones. And this morning, news editor could not use his email. Surprise. So, and we, until about 5 o'clock this evening, we're still experiencing problems with mobile phones.
Okay, I'd just like to say that if you're in Trafalgar Square on New Year's Eve here in London, you also have problems with your mobile phone. So it's not necessarily.
I think what I've heard from our colleagues on the ground as well is that it is bulk messages that have been blocked, like bulk SMSs and the like. But in terms of using other social media applications like WhatsApp, you can. I was communicating. I'm not to say that people have not been experiencing problems, but I woke up very early in the morning and I tried to encourage all my family to go out and vote, and I kept checking, have you gone? Have you voted? Yeah, so I managed to do that without any inconvenience. But I'm sure other people would have had a different experience.
Yeah, my news editor's issue was he couldn't use his cell phone, but when he borrowed a friend's, he was able to use it. Just his phone was not usable.
His was targeted or something.
Okay, starting on how the results might, in fact, not match up to our hopes and expectations. How much strategic voting do you think there may be this time? In 2008, there was a factor of strategic voting, of voting for the president and then voting alternatively within the National Assembly. Do you think this may be a factor? And then we want to come on to the extent to which the vote may be stuffed or manipulated. But this question of strategic voting.
Right. Zimbabweans, I think, if you look at the way they vote, most people in the rural areas, they tend to vote for the president. And then, I'm talking about historically, particularly if you look at the 2002 election and then the 2008 election, most people in the rural areas, they would vote for the president, that is Mugabe, that is ZANU-PF, the presidential candidate. And then when it comes to the parliamentary candidate, they would normally sort of, choose whoever they wanted, whether it was MDC or MDCT or, ZANU-PF. I don't know if that is going to be the kind of same pattern this year, but that's a possibility. I mean, if you look at historical, there's a possibility that might be the case this year as well.
Yeah.
In the last election, ZANU-PF MPs were obviously tired of Mugabe. They wanted to get rid of him. And they had a saying in Shona called Bora Musango, kick the ball into the long grass. Vote for me as your MP, but vote for somebody else for president. And Mugabe has been trying to get the two warring factions within his party to vote for him and not adopt the Bora Msango strategy.
Yeah, that's true. In 2008, while ZANU-PF trailed the MDC by a single vote, or at least taken together, the two MDC factions, they trailed the two MDC factions by at least 11 seats. And yet, in terms of the popular vote, ZANU-PF had the bigger, margin, of the vote, which is quite, striking, because the presidential elections were being, run concurrently. So somebody would go into the polling booth and vote for a ZANU-PF candidate for MP and councillor, and then for president, either vote for Simba Makoni or vote for Morgan Tsvangirai or not vote at all, which was quite interesting. And so now the mantra in ZANU-PF has been, Bora Mugedi, let's get it into the nets, let's score, as it were. So it's interesting to see whether or how successful this bid to try and unite, those factions or disgruntled factions has been. Again, it raises a question. Did people do that because their faction leaders told them not to? Or was this just ordinary voters rationally deciding that, no, I do not think that Mugabe presents the best value for our country, so I will not vote for him. So while the faction leaders may have united with Mugabe, it remains to be seen whether the people or ZANU-PF supporters have followed suit. They might still kick it in the long grass.
Okay, so having thought about whether indeed every single vote will count, if I could ask, please, what are your views on the election observers? Because a great deal has been made of the presence of the African Union led by General Obasanjo, who after all is an African, a man who's overseen a transition from authoritarian rule to democracy in Nigeria, a man who carries enormous authority. But do you think the election observers are in any, how far do you feel that they are going to deliver their function to oversee, is it free and fair and therefore credible?
So we start with the African Union. Because Zana Zuma has already pronounced the elections free and fair, even before people cast their ballots. Obasanjo has overseen elections elsewhere in Africa, which he declared free and fair, which were completely not free and fair, which were stolen.
Wait, because they didn't deliver the result people wanted, or because they weren't actually free and fair in the electoral process?
They were not,
two completely different things.
They were not free or fair. Mm-hmm. In Zimbabwe, in the region, in Southern Africa, the Southern African Development Committee countries have a norm for elections. Zimbabwe has breached every one of those norms already. So, in fact, SADC observers should declare that Zimbabwe has failed to meet the test. Right now, as we see, before even people casted their ballots, Zimbabwe had failed the test. But, mark my words, they are going to declare this election free and fair because there was absence of violence. That's the only thing. Their bar is very, very low.
But I beg to differ, in certain respects with your perspective on the especially the SADC, election monitoring aspect, because of the 2008 elections and all the problems associated with them. Zimbabwe has been made the focus of a SADC, and there was the SADC protocol, because it became almost like a test case. All these measures being implemented in Zimbabwe, being asked to sign up to, which don't quite exist in the same way in other Southern African countries. But then the problem is the political situation in those countries is not as conflictual as the one in Zimbabwe, does not draw the same attention as it does in Zimbabwe. Indeed, a lot of elections take place in other African countries which don't quite register either on the African radar or internationally as Zimbabwe does. So we've got to acknowledge that and establish that Zimbabwe draws a lot of interest domestically as in Africa and internationally. And so the bar set for Zimbabwe is much higher than for many other countries. And I would say this as well for the Commonwealth. When Zimbabwe was kicked out, but Pervez Musharraf, still with his military fatigues, was invited in.
I agree.
So the problem is there's a very high bar. The test will never meet perhaps maybe international standards as in the UK or other countries. But I hate to say that, I hate to speak of like African standards as though perhaps maybe there should be a kind of inferior barometer. But realistically speaking, I do not think that the situation that is obtaining in Zimbabwe today is so far off the mark from what is happening in other African countries. And what verdict SADC is going to push will not obviously be the ideal, or perhaps maybe satisfy a lot of the standard democratic ideals. But I think they are going to weigh it on balance. ZANU-PF is very wary of Obasanjo because they fell out with him in 2003. When we had the Abuja Commonwealth Summit, Obasanjo, shuttled to Harare to try and persuade Robert Mugabe to step down, allow succession to take place, so that perhaps maybe we pacify Tony Blair and they allow Zimbabwe, they lift the suspension and Zimbabwe can be allowed to participate. And predictably, Mugabe and ZANU told Obasanjo to go to hell, and then the suspension was extended, and Mugabe took Zimbabwe out of the Commonwealth. So there's no love lost between ZANU-PF and Obasanjo. When he arrived, not even a single government official came to meet him. So they suspect that Obasanjo might sway the AU to come out with a more stringent verdict on the elections.
I think before Obasanjo came to Zimbabwe, there was a lot of criticism that was made by the ZANU-PF, some of the ZANU-PF senior officials. Actually, when the chief of AU, Dr. Zuma, came to Zimbabwe, Obasanjo was not there. I think he only came a week after. I think this was an indication that I think he got a message from the criticism that was made by ZANU-PF that we're not happy that you have been made the sort of the official observer on behalf of the SADC, the African Union. I think my biggest concern to me is the international community, that they have been very quiet as compared to the previous year. They have shown literally no interest in this election, in the form of the political class and also in the form of the media. I mean, I was watching the BBC, for example, today, the whole day. It wasn't the big headline news as it was, for example, in 2008 and 2002. And I think this is just giving some kind of a license to SADC and also the AU to say, you know what, you can go ahead and say what you want about the SADC.
Wilf and I were both on the BBC this morning, so that's a great pity that we weren't headline news. But no, I agree. I looked at my news feed, and it isn't the top story. I accept that. I accept that.
I just wanted to pick up from what Chafamba said about the Zimbabwe and Obasanjo. You might recall that in 1996, there was a Commonwealth Heads of State and Government meeting in Harare.
1991.
91, sorry, 91. And I was heavily involved with that meeting. And it was Zimbabwean officials who drew up the agenda and set what was then known as the Harare Declaration of Standards that had to be adhered to by any member of the Commonwealth. It was Zimbabwe, Mugabe pushing. And as a result of that, Nigeria was kicked out of the Commonwealth because it didn't meet these standards.
Yeah, in 95. I know, this is an appalling irony.
So I think Nigeria was paying back in kind.
Just finally, before I open it to questions from the floor, how far do you three think that the result might be accepted or contested, as in 2008? I mean, this, there are stages of this election.
I think ZANU-PF, they are very confident that they are going to win this election. And I don't see them accepting if they lose. And I've always said that you know, ZANU-PF, they've got this mentality that people don't sort of read, that they feel that they're entitled to owning this country. This is their country. They have to own it. So if they lose this election, I don't see them saying that we've lost this election. I think what they might force is some kind of a coalition government with the MDC, because if you look at ZANU-PF, they're entrenched into the power structures of you know, Zimbabwe. If you look at the judiciary that we've been talking about, for example, if you look at the security sector, if you look at the society itself, I mean, they've got a lot of...
The informal economy.
Exactly.
Permeating at so many levels.
Exactly. So I think it will be very difficult for ZANU-PF to stand, you know, to stand down and say, we have lost it. They might say, we have lost it, but I think you have to cede some kind of power to us. Maybe we need to share you know, the power in some form of a coalition government.
I agree. If you look at the MDC, Tendai BT has been holding press conferences all day in Harare, and he's been pointing out some of the problems that they're experiencing, and which proves to me that they will contest the results once they are out, if they lose. And ZANU-PF, as you say, will also contest. So I can see these Constitutional Court being very busy in the next few weeks.
I think with the SADC and AU observation standards not quite up to the ideal, it is a fact that the level of scrutiny, you know, over these elections is greater than in 2008. So what that does is it closes a little wriggle room for ZANU-PF. Secondly, the attitude of the MDC. In 2008, what happened, or at least off the record according to people I've spoken to as well, and this was, I think, was it the New York Times, one of the American papers, or the Washington Post, that reported Mugabe actually conceding, but then his generals talking him out of it.
New York Times, yes.
Yeah, talking him out of it. So what he said at that press conference about conceding isn't new, because it happened. But then what made the difference was the MDC, through Tendai BT, announced that Mugabe Tsvangirai had won it, and he got into trouble with the law. But BT declared that he won it by 53%. And the information is that actually it was far much higher than that. So when BT declared the 53%, ZANU-PF knew that, the MDC doesn't have a clue by how much they had won the vote. Really? So it allowed them
the manipulation.
Yes, and when ZANU turned up the heat after BT announced, they both ran out of the country. Mugabe Tsvangirai went to the South African embassy, and then he went to Botswana. Yes. Tendai BT left. So the winners won. They didn't know by how much they had won, and then they bailed out. So that gave room for ZANU-PF to re-strategize. And they said, hold on, let's rework this and engineer a runoff. And then say, Mugabe Tsvangirai, yes, he won, but he won by less than the threshold. So there's a runoff. So they breathed almost like new life to what was a dead and defeated party. So this time round, the MDC has learned from their mistakes. I do not think that they are going to give any leeway to ZANU-PF to try and run off with it. So in the event that there is a huge turnover, which is what the MDC needs to overcome all the advantages that ZANU-PF has vested in the system, the electoral system. If there is that, and they win the popular vote, it might well be that they will stand their ground. So I would still like to believe that it is possible for the MDC to win it and claim their victory.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to open it now to questions from the floor. I think there may be quite a number, so I'd like to take groups of questions. Question here at the back. If you'd like to identify yourself, please, and say whether you'd like to put it to a particular member of the panel or to all three speakers.
Hi, Phil Bailey, Zimbabwean living in London. It's an open question to all the panel. Is there an African equivalent to Arab Spring? And if the answer to that is no, how many generations is ZANU-PF's honeymoon period for bringing independence to people in Zimbabwe?
Okay, two more questions here, and then for the panelists, please, to respond.
Hi, this question is to Wilf Mbanga, Trevor Grande. Wilf, what do you think what do you think is the future of ZAPU under the leadership of Damiso Debangwa? And the second question is, what do you think is the the memory of young people in Zimbabwe about Gukurahundi? Is it an issue any longer?
Okay, so a question about Arab Spring, the future of ZAPU, and whether there is a residual collective memory among youth about Gukurahundi. So if you'd like to begin on Arab Spring.
I don't think there's an equivalent of Arab Spring in Sub-Saharan Africa because to me, I think the Arab Spring is driven mostly by political Islam, of which, if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, we don't have some sort of a unifying kind of, should I say, a force in the form of, say, a religion. And also, if you look at Zimbabwe in particular, if you look at the security sector, it's quite repressive. It's very repressive that people in Zimbabwe, they are afraid of rising up against the state.
The one big spring that I would say exists in Zimbabwe today is the Pentecostal spring. There is a huge outpouring of Pentecostalism in the country, which is very pacifying. So young people, old people, everybody turns to church and they turn to God. You should have heard it in Tsvangirai own speeches, that he's done everything possible and God is on our side. And on newszimbabwe.com today, we have the young Minister of Information Technology in the MDC, Nelson Chamisa, urging the country to fast for victory. And then this was preceded by several prophecies, one by which would have gladdened the MDC. One Lesotho prophet said he sees a new dawn in Zimbabwe and a new flag being raised and the dictatorship being put asunder. Yet another one from Kenya. And then there was a debate about this big Nigerian prophet called T.B. Joshua. He specializes in predicting the deaths of popular people, including the Malawian Bingu wa Mtarika. So these things are given much attention. And while we were impressed by politicians packing stadiums and rallies, the prophets in Zimbabwe, they do that week in, week out, effortlessly. And if this election had fallen on a Sunday, perhaps maybe we'd be debating how many people would turn out for service or for voting. So I don't see an uprising, a political uprising in Zimbabwe. I do not see that happening.
I mean, if I can just add on to that point, that if you look at most people who are now attending church, they attend this evangelical kind of, religion, which is very apathetic when it comes to politics. They say that you don't have to be involved in politics. The only person that you have to be involved with is God.
Well, I think Arab Spring is an Arab Spring, not an African Spring. Coming to Trevor, sorry, I can't remember the question again.
ZAPU.
Oh, ZAPU, whether ZAPU will survive. I think ZAPU will survive. It's articulating the issues that a lot of people in Matabeleland are worried about, things that they're talking about. That's what ZAPU is articulating. I don't think they will do well in this election. I think there will be some strategic voting. People realize they're a small party. They're not even contesting some seats in Mashonaland. They're not going to form a next government. Dumiso Dabengwa himself, the leader of the party, withdrew his candidature for the presidency. You realize that he wasn't going to win anything. He didn't want to embarrass himself. So, but they will remain as a pressure group in Matabeleland. As for the second part of your question,
it was a memory of
yes, a lot of young people in Matabeleland have been told about Gukurahundi. I remember a couple of months ago when I was in Johannesburg, I went to visit a friend, and he had a couple of young people from Bulawayo were visiting him. And they were watching a video that has been done about Gukurahundi. These are young people in their 20s. There are videos that are being produced in South Africa about Gukurahundi. And these kids watch this. And I could see, the anger in them watching this, footage of Zimbabwean soldiers killing people in Matabeleland. So that is going to be a real issue in Matabeleland, and it has to be dealt with somehow.
If you don't mind me jumping onto the ZAPU question, I've always considered this relationship between the Welshman Mugabe MDC, that's the splinter from Morgan Tsvangirai's MDC, and ZAPU. And now they've formed an alliance. They are fighting this election as a coalition. But ZAPU, a formerly national party, was beaten back into a regional party, by ZANU-PF and Mugabe, and which is what they are today. The MDC faction of Welshman Mugabe is also that. The themes that they have chosen for this election is devolution, which resonates well with voters in that region, because there's a strong feeling that Matabeleland has been marginalized, in national development, and then also there is the unresolved, grievance of the Gukurahundi massacres, and so you have these two parties on the same turf. Now they've decided to work together. I've considered that perhaps maybe it would work well for the MDC and ZAPU to merge into one party under the brand name ZAPU, because it has greater resonance. Welshman Mugabe has struggled to define himself, his MDC, outside of the shadow of Morgan Tsvangirai's MDC. When you say the MDC, people think Tsvangirai MDC. So in terms of branding and in terms of national space, he is always going to struggle to come out of Tsvangirai's shadow, or the shadow of Tsvangirai's MDC. So if he gets into a union with Dabengwa and ZAPU, and they call themselves ZAPU, it also has resonance ideologically, because when that MDC faction of Welshman Mugabe got Arthur Mtambara to be their leader, Arthur Mtambara tried to infuse a nationalism in the MDC, which he felt was lacking in Tsvangirai's MDC. So he said, I come standing on the shoulders of Nikita Mangena, of Josiah Tongogara, the heroes of the National Liberation Movement, because Tsvangirai doesn't say stuff like that, and which is where ZANU-PF attacks him. And he thought perhaps maybe to try and as a rearguard action, let's infuse some nationalism into this movement. And so we have a connecting thread running from African nationalism through African national liberation, and now we are a pro-democracy movement, but we're informed, by this historical perspective. So ZAPU and MDC joining together would provide just that.
Other questions? I think this historical narrative, this parallel historical narrative, really does play out very strongly, and class interest too. Questions here, and then a question here.
Steve Kibble from the Zimbabwe Europe Network, a lobbying group in Europe. There seems to be quite a quiet kind of response from the international community at the present time, particularly from the EU. And although you're Zimbabweans, and not necessarily privy to everything that happens in EU politics, why do you think the international community has been fairly quiet? Is it the diamonds? Is it they think sanctions haven't worked? Is it that the MDC has not impressed them at all?
Okay, thank you very much. Or is it that they've been shut out of the Zimbabwean space effectively?
Keith Raffan, to what extent has the MDC itself been tainted by corruption and allegations of corruption, which we read about in the press here, and in the left-wing press as well, and also its alleged incompetence in running local government in places like Gweru?
Okay, and there was a question here, a lady in the fourth or fifth row.
Thank you. It's more a statement than a question. I'm Dorcas Guata. I'm one of the many Zimbabweans living in London. A little bit disappointed to not see any females on the panel today. Significant. Sorry, it's females about. Significant because there were women's votes are significant. Part of understanding why Mr. Mugabe remains so strongly in power is really about understanding the social problems that we have in Zimbabwe. I worked in Bade some years ago, looking after patients with HIV and AIDS and mental health, and you get a real strong sense of patriotism and why people believe in him, because he has a stronghold there. And I'm just wondering whether you feel on both sides of Mr. Mugabe and MDC that there is that strong understanding of the social problems that we had we've gone from the bread basket to the begging bowl. And unless we understand that, we will not understand quite why Mr. Mugabe has such a stronghold.
Okay, so this question of social gender aspects to this whole election. Okay, I've been told that we've got to stop. Do we have any flexibility to go on past 8 o'clock, or does it have to stop? Okay, fabulous. Thank you very much indeed. So a question about EU.
I'm going to respond to that one. I think one of the reasons is because of the coalition government, because MDC being the coalition government, it has given the Zimbabwean government some kind of a friendly face, which makes it difficult for the EU to criticize, Mugabe, because it's Tsvangirai within the government. And I think the other reason is that the EU might have felt that Mugabe is not going anyway. And the more they criticize him, the more they are driving him into the hands of the Chinese. I mean, for example, look at right now, most of the contracts on diamonds have been given to the Chinese. And then I think the other thing is that if you look at Tsvangirai himself, he has been, his party has been involved in things such as corruption. And if you look at his personal life itself, he has been involved in a number of scandals. And criticizing Mugabe without criticizing Tsvangirai, I think, was sort of making the EU look like they are very hypocritical. So in order for them not to criticize Tsvangirai, they sort of hold their tongue and say, we're not going to criticize ZANU-PF as well.
I take a cynical view. The European Union is worried about the Chinese influence in Zimbabwe. The Chinese virtually control our diamonds, a lot of gold mining. They are in our game parks. They are everywhere. Our shops are full of Chinese goods, which Zimbabweans refer to as Xinjiang products. So the Chinese are, in there. They don't care about your politics. They don't care about human rights. They are in there to make money. We have a lot of Chinese restaurants now in Harare. Mandarin is now taught at the University of Zimbabwe. So the Chinese are very there, in a big way. And the West, particularly the European Union, is worried about this Chinese influence. And they realize that, the only way to get back into Zimbabwe, through trade, is to come to terms, accommodating Mugabe somehow. And that's how I feel that, the European Union is softened its stance only because of trade.
Even before the unity government came to be, I think it was back in 2000, after the 2005 elections, in which the MDC lost a great deal of its parliamentary seats, and ZANU-PF ended up with 2/3 majority, and after which the MDC split into two factions. There was the biggest game in town then was ZANU-PF factionalism. And there was the faction of the late General Solomon Mijuru doing the rounds in diplomatic circles, selling their a vision of a Zimbabwe under their faction. And the interesting thing, it was reported in The Guardian as well, and some of the international press. The interesting thing was that their plan actually had buy-in from governments in the European Union. They were ready to play ball with a ZANU-PF faction if it came to power. So I think that for quite some time, many countries in the international community have been looking for a way to get back to business, and but to do that, to climb down and still retain moral consistency was the problem. And enter the inclusive government in 2008, it makes everything easier, which is why I don't think that if SADC and the AU pronounce these elections free and fair, while the MDC is protesting that they weren't, they will get much traction out here. I think that ultimately, if SADC, AU endorse the results, and there's a new government, particularly also if ZANU-PF moves swiftly to resolve the succession of Robert Mugabe and retire him with the comfort and backup of a fresh term of office for the would-be successor, the West will do business with Zimbabwe. On corruption, somebody asked
yes,
something.
Yes, the question of corruption of MDC and corruption was the question, and then the question of this social issue, which I really would like to explore further.
Yeah, well, the corruption, Mugabe has been making a lot of song and dance about Morgan Tsvangirai's morality. He can talk. He fathered a child with a married woman while his own wife, Sally, was on her deathbed. And Morgan Tsvangirai had a string of women after his wife died. So he was available during that period.
I don't think it's a question of moral relativism in this instance, but simply that it was just a low blow for Mugabe, or the case of somebody who's in a glass house throwing stones at the other. But the issue of corruption in itself is actually quite key. I think it's as fundamental and really key to Zimbabwe's future development as the issue of violence is to Zimbabwe's democratic development. Corruption is real. I was here in 2011, at the start of 2011, and we had people from some of the risk analysis firms in the audience who came up and actually confessed, or at least maybe gave us testimonies of their own experiences with MDC ministers in government, in the inclusive government, that now what we do is when there's a company that wants to invest in Zimbabwe and we are proposing the deal, we make sure we advise them to have a cut for the MDC minister, because there's always there's an MDC minister and a ZANU deputy, or where the ministry is under the MDC, there's a ZANU deputy. So what you do if you're a company going to invest in Zimbabwe, you have a cut for the MDC and a cut for the ZANU guy. Now, I think there's no defense to be made about the issue of corruption or to say who is more corrupt than the other. The tragedy is that our country is mired in a culture of corruption, and it is so insidious that it filters through to every structure. Those of the MDC councillors that went into the council who are running urban Zimbabwe at local level, as it were, some of them had to be fired by the MDC. Perhaps maybe you would say that Morgan Tsvangirai showed some spine by firing some of the corrupt officials, whereas Mugabe has yet to fire in 33 years anyone for corruption.
Okay, but if I could ask panelists, please, to address this question of the parties that have been explicit in saying that they would address the day-to-day issues of people, the questions of delivery of healthcare, the questions of access to education and affordable, access to housing, sanitation, which are identified not exclusively but particularly to women's issues. So is there a gendered aspect, in fact, then to this election that has not been sufficiently discussed this evening?
Well, to be honest, I don't think I'm the best person to sort of discuss on those issues.
I don't think anything has really come up as high as some of the issues that the parties have been are battling over. ZANU-PF goes around with its indigenization and economic empowerment agenda. That the jobs are going to flow from there, and then they are going to revive industry. They don't explain how they are going to also simultaneously invite foreign direct investment so that that industry can be revived and people can get jobs and livelihoods can improve. Sadly, there's been an underplaying of social justice issues. They say it, anecdotally, but in terms of the big ideas that are doing the rounds, in this election, I have not heard any significant message on social justice, nor addressing the issues that are of particular concern to women.
Well, all the parties agreed that they would reserve a certain proportion of seats for women in the election.
Because that's in the Constitution,
it's
isn't
in the Constitution.
That there's going to be PR representation of 60 women in the Assembly.
Right, but what has happened in reality, only the MDC, Tsvangirai, has got more women candidates standing for the House of Assembly. And even with them, they did not reach the 60 or 50%. I think that was the figure that they were pushing. There are woefully few women in positions of power in Zimbabwe or standing as MPs. But an interesting statistic I had this morning was that in the queues of people voting this morning, it was almost 2 to 1, 2 women to every man in the queue. So there's a lot of interest among women, and yet they're voting for men.
Questions? Here, here, and then here, please. So.
Hi, my name is Chennai and I'm Zimbabwean. Just going back to, you were talking about the issues, and I think it's interesting how when people go to vote, they're motivated a lot by the rhetoric, especially with ZANU-PF. And it's interesting to me how no one's actually talking about what issues ZAPU and MDC, what is their stance on these issues, because I'm bored by the land redistribution and indigenization. If I was in Zimbabwe, I'd actually want to know about the social issues that ladies referred to. We can invite all the foreign direct investment we want, but we've got a labor force that's dying and can't actually afford to live. How are we going to be attractive to any country? So what is their stance on these issues?
Question? There's a second question.
Yes, my name is Solomon. Talking about those social issues in Zimbabwe, it's interesting that just the other day, World Bank was banding around these figures that, and I'm sure most of you have read, that Zimbabwe has got the highest literacy rate in Africa. And I'm just wondering, why is that the case in a country that we know socially it's been taken down the drain, if you like? But my other question is that Morgan Tsvangirai has said, whatever the result, whether he's the winner or not, the result will be illegitimate. What next for Zimbabwe then?
Okay, thank you very much. And a question here.
My name's Tim Garber. I've stood for Parliament in Kent 3 years ago and standing again. Just on the corruption issue, the issue of gun running, blood diamonds, I can assure you is going on into European airports and into Kent airports. I actually stood on a manifesto of Stop the Corruption because it's absolutely so blatant. Can I just ask, in terms of the British Parliament and Zimbabwe, do they just not care about Zimbabwe anymore? Is it completely off the agenda? It seems to be.
Okay, so questions of what has been the party's varying stance on social issues, the myth of the literacy rate, and this question of legitimacy or illegitimacy of the outcome, and the British government and questions of corruption.
I'm going to answer this gentleman's question. I think MDC, as you have rightly pointed out, they said that they're not going to accept the result if it doesn't come out in their favor. I think they've got three options. Firstly, is to go to the courts, to appeal to the courts. And if you look at the composition of the courts, as we've been saying earlier on, it's made up of people or made up of judges who are very sympathetic to ZANU-PF. And it's very unlikely if those judges make a ruling which is in favor of the MDC. And then the second option is for them to should I say, appeal to the people in Zimbabwe and say, you know what, your vote has been stolen. Are you just going to sit down and not do anything? And it's up to the people of Zimbabwe to do some kind of a social protest or to rise up against Mugabe. And knowing the security sector in Zimbabwe, how very repressive it is, I really doubt very much if people are going to come out of their houses and say we're going to demonstrate against Mugabe, in some form of, an equivalence of the Arab Spring. And then the third option is the international community putting a lot of pressure on Mugabe and saying, look, you have lost the election, you have to stand down. But I think if you look at the indications so far, the international community has not shown any interest in this election at all. And if you look at SADC and the AU, who are going to be the reference point for the international community, if you look at SADC, they've literally been neutered by ZANU-PF. They are not, I think they're likely to say, to declare the election free and fair, whichever way it comes. And the AU as well, as we were saying, the AU chief has come out and said, the preparations for the elections have been so far good. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the MDC if they lose this election. Their options are very, very limited.
Yeah. On the social issues that you addressed, with the MDC Welshman faction, they speak of devolution because they are trying to emphasize the importance of local governance. that government should be closer to the people and be more responsive, to the needs and interests of the people. And so I think the Constitution does provide for a certain level of devolution, no? If you can
a certain amount, yeah.
Yeah, yes, and this is what they're trying to drum up, citing certain things as resources being produced in a certain locality, and yet no reciprocal development coming into it. You can even take that to a place like Manicaland, where you have the diamonds being mined in Marange around Mutare, then they are spirited all the way to Harare and then flown out of the country, and there's nothing to show in the local community. With ZANU-PF, everything is subsumed by indigenization and economic empowerment, and so youths and women are urged to think in terms of business projects, but then it's a mystery where the funding for such projects is coming from. What we've seen is something that is akin to patronage, where the indigenization ministry led by Xavier Kasukwere doles out monies to youth groups and women's groups so that they engage in certain business projects. But this was in the run-up to the elections. After the elections, it remains to be seen whether there's going to be such a pot to invest in women's entrepreneurial initiatives. On the issue of whether the UK Parliament is still interested in Zimbabwe concerning issues to do with corruption and diamonds and and gun running, it's interesting how the Conservative government or Conservative-led coalition has taken a fairly different approach to the Zimbabwe question. There was a talk given by SOAS Professor Stephen Chan in Zimbabwe, I think 1.5 years back, where he tried to explain British policy on Zimbabwe. And he said that they have adopted a wait-and-see attitude. They have toned down the bluster that characterized the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, or the Labour years, and they made it a decision that they will not, be muddied, by a tussle with Mugabe, because it can get real dirty if you engage him. And so he said they took the approach that sooner or later he's going to die, and we will engage, with the successor, leadership there. And everything now has been directed through, it's always say that British policy is driven either through the transatlantic relationship and across the channel through the EU or through the Commonwealth. And in this particular instance, they've chosen to drive the Zimbabwe policy through the EU. So there is this Zimbabwe ministerial team that is leading engagement with European Union countries. So the European representative now speaks or articulates European policy on Zimbabwe on behalf of all countries, really. So you are not likely to hear William Hague addressing it or the UK Parliament addressing it. There is an all-party parliamentary group on Zimbabwe led by Kate Hoey. I think she's been toned down as well. And when she spoke out, I think there was one mistake that she did where she waded into controversial ground over the commemoration of a plane that was shot during the Liberation War, and that invited obvious brickbats from nationalist quarters that you are rooting for the Rhodesians. So she's not had much traction during the inclusive government. So that's where things stand. It is Zimbabwe through the EU, and the British Parliament has kind of, as well as the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, they've kind of deferred to the EU to handle that.
If I could just follow up on that, because the British government, as you've said, Trifamba, have deliberately sought to downplay it so that to take the inflammatory rhetoric and also for Britain to be a target. But that does not mean that there haven't been, as you say, exploring through discrete ways, through the Friends of Zimbabwe, through the EU, but also through the Commonwealth and the High Commission's network. The American ambassador, who is now down in Zimbabwe, is considered to be much more conciliatory and open to discussion. Similarly, if you like, within the old Commonwealth network, some of whom are extraordinarily knowledgeable and well connected in the question in Harare. So it's not that Britain doesn't have a policy, it is deliberately gone below the radar. because otherwise to have a more public policy is seen to be fundamentally counterproductive to its future engagement in Zimbabwe and to offer help and assistance. It does offer humanitarian assistance on health, education, and those have been relative success stories in terms of channeling it into Zimbabwe, trying to circumvent it rather than it being siphoned off through corrupt practices. So there is a degree of engagement, but thinking, how could this engagement best be helpful? Are there other questions?
So I just wanted to address the question of the ZAPU and MDC, that they feel they've been marginalized, especially by the media, and this is because I think everybody accepts that they're not projecting themselves as national parties. They're concentrating on regional issues. And also, if you look at the number of candidates they've put forward in this election, they are not contesting seats in Manicaland or in Mashonaland and so on. So they've been crowded out. The fight here, the major fight in Zimbabwe today is between the MDCT and ZANU-PF. So everybody is looking at those two parties. One of them is likely to form, or is going to form the next government. There's no way ZAPU or Mugabe could be the next president of Zimbabwe. So their views have been crowded out.
Can I just jump in here?
Please.
Well, okay. If you look at MDCN, which is the smaller faction of Osman Ncube, they won a number of seats in the last election in 2008. And judging by the crowds that have been attending there, I think they are going to eat into the constituents that have traditionally voted for Mugabe Tsvangirai. And I think if you look at the grievances that the people from Matabeleland and Midland regions have against Tsvangirai and Mugabe, that is going to influence a lot of people in those regions to vote for the smaller faction of the MDC. So I wouldn't be surprised if Tsvangirai, if he's to lose the election, if he's to lose the presidential election, I think it's going to be because of ZAPU and the MDC, the smaller MDC function.
Okay, I'm going to take another round of questions and then draw this discussion to a close. So question here, here, and here.
I'm Corrie. I grew up in Zimbabwe and were forced to leave in 2000. I was 10 when we left, and I have a very idyllic idea of what Zimbabwe was like, and I'm interested to know what the best case scenario is following this election for the people of Zimbabwe. So ignoring the politics and the EU, or not the politics, the EU and the kind of international issues. And also a realistic view, not our dream.
Most tinted one.
Okay, so best case and realistic, two are not necessarily the same.
Thank you. My name's Richard Pantlin. I was in Zimbabwe in April. And my question follows on from the previous one, really. There's one thing that's really heartened me tonight, and that is to hear mention of a possible coalition after the election. I didn't think that was provided for in the Constitution, actually. And I mean, in my mind, there is no doubt but that Mugabe will be declared the winner by fair means or foul, frankly. I think, and actually, and this may be a provocative question, but actually, given the position of the security forces, despite the Constitution saying that they will not accept an alternative government, and the fact that their power is very much tied up with the diamond industry and so on, that they're going to be very loath to relinquish power. So might that not actually be at least an acceptable, most peaceful outcome of the situation for there to be a Mugabe government that continues in some form of coalition? And is that a distinct possibility?
Okay, so political power versus economic power. Happened in 1980. Question here, and then there was a fourth question just at the back there.
Hello, Malcolm Begg. Actually, building a bit on the first question, but when would you see as the soonest, whatever the result of this election, that Zimbabwe could hope to be kind of re-accepted fully into the international community and perhaps into the Commonwealth itself?
fourth question here, and then I'm sorry, that has to be the last question.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask about this election being the first to be held under the new constitution, and on paper there were some signs, some indications of reform in that constitution. So I wanted to ask, should we be encouraged by what we saw there?
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Right, I'm going to respond to the question by the young lady. I am very optimistic because I think even if Mugabe wins, I don't see him being president for the next 5 years. One, it's because of the provision in the constitution which says that if a president, the new constitution, which ZANU-PF fought very hard for that to be included in the constitution, which says that if a president dies or falls ill or resigns for whatever reason, he has to be succeeded by somebody within the party. I think that's a very good indicator that Mugabe is likely to step down. And then secondly, if you look at the press conference that was done yesterday, there was a gentleman called Emerson Mnangagwa, who has always been sort of touted as the possible successor to Mugabe. He was there at the press conference. Why was he there at the press conference? I mean, Mugabe gave a reason, which I thought was a very stupid reason, but I think he was sort of telling the international community that this is a guy who's likely to, to take over from me. To sort of, answer your question as well, I think ZANU-PF and the coalition government in general have done quite a lot of sort of groundwork in order to be accepted into the international community. For example, if you look at the rhetoric from Mugabe, it has been very toned down as compared to the previous year. He hasn't been, making a lot of noise about, Britain. So I think they are likely to be accepted in the international community at some point in the near future if ZANU-PF wins. I think, obviously, if MDCT wins, obviously, it will be some sort of an automatic sort of acceptance into the international community. I mean, as long as Mugabe is not going to be there, I think it's going to be easy for the international community to be...
Sanctions will be lifted.
I think
exactly,
so.
and then it will be, I think, quite a quick step back.
Yeah, but the second part of your question, I think, was about the army, whether they would accept, Morgan Tsvangirai and so on. Is well, the generals have been saying all along that they will never accept Morgan Tsvangirai as the president. But Mugabe on Monday this week said, well, it's not the army, it's just a few individuals. So he kind of dismissed them. But we do know that, it's the generals who have been propping up Mugabe. And he can't do without them. They know they can't survive without Mugabe. And that's why they're keeping him there. And
the Constitution has a point on this in saying that it's going to be the National Security Council and they can only serve on that. Senior generals can only serve on that for a certain length of time.
And then, pleasure of the president.
Yes.
And whoever the president is. But just in the youth development this evening, I don't know whether you heard that the Army headquarters put out a word that all Army reservists and all retired soldiers should report for duty tomorrow morning in Harare. We don't know what this means.
I think the most realistic picture, which I think would be the most hopeful as well, is and which also speaks to the concerns that you raised about the military and their reluctance to cede power to a government none other than Mugabe's, is that whoever wins the election, there is a government of national unity. I think Zimbabwe needs to learn something about leading by consensus. I think we need consensus leadership. There's this arrogance within ZANU-PF that we fought the war, we won the country, we deserve to rule. And there's also a sense or a culture, there's a culture of entitlement in Zimbabwean politics. You win the war, therefore you deserve to rule. In the MDC, you fought for democracy, you got beaten up and got incarcerated, you got detained, and if, for instance, you come and you are joined, I have a friend who is now the advisor of the Prime Minister, and he's a lawyer. One of the things that is thrown at him is, so where is this guy coming from? Show us your scars. Where were you detained? And these are the kinds of things that we would like to avoid, where there is a rewarding of those who are the activists. They use the language, we were in the trenches. So they are the trenches from the 1970s liberation war, and then they are the new trenches from the democratic change, movement. And I would like to see perhaps maybe working together in government where the best elements of either side, work together. And also, in order to secure the buy-in from such entrenched interests as the military, who do not want to let go. I know there's going to be a lot of acceptance of very unsavory characters, in this future Zimbabwe that is coming. What did Robert Mugabe do when he was threatened by the Rhodesian Front Army in 1980? He approached General Peter Walls and made him his army commander. And he approached Ken Flower and made him his chief of intelligence. If Morgan Tsvangirai wins, he's going to have to learn from Mugabe's book and do something like that and keep some of these very, unpleasant characters on board, but trying to imbue everybody with a sense of common purpose. I think that's the best way forward.
A political strategy of reconciliation, then. I realise that we've reached time. Thank you very much indeed to my three panellists, to the questions from the floor. But I'd just like to conclude by asking each of my fellow panellists to say in one sentence, when do you think the result is going to be called?
I don't know.
That was it.
The first results will probably be in tomorrow afternoon.
The final result will probably be in after the weekend.
And I'm going to say, I hope the people of Zimbabwe get the result they deserve. Okay, thank you very much indeed.